Speaker andapos. It's a strange thing that happens the moment someone believes no one important is watching them. Their posture changes, their voice changes. The warmth they showed you 30 seconds ago in front of other people quietly evaporates. Yuandapos probably felt this before and dismissed it as a bad mood, or a busy day, or nothing at all, but it isnandapos, nothing. Itandapos, information. Here is the observation that should unsettle you a little. Most people are not lying to you with their words. They are lying to you with their consistency. Words are cheap and easy to control. Consistency is expensive. It requires a person to behave the same way whether or not the behavior earns them anything. And it turns out that almost nobody can fake that for long because faking it requires constant, effortful calculation, and effortful calculation always shows a seam somewhere. This is not a script about spotting liars by their eye movements or crossed arms. That approach has been popular for decades, and it doesn't in a post hold up particularly well under scrutiny. What we andapos are going to explore instead is something quieter and far more reliable. The difference between behavior that is performed for an audience and behavior that exists independent of one. Once you understand this difference, you stop needing tricks. You start noticing on your own, almost automatically, the way a person who has learned a language stops translating word by word and simply understands. The central idea running through everything in this video is this: authenticity is not a personality trait you can detect by watching someone perform. Itandapos is a pattern you detect by watching what a person does when performing stops being useful to them. Keep that sentence in mind. Every section that follows will return to it from a different angle: psychology, history, leadership, philosophy, because it is the single thread that ties genuine character to visible behavior. Most people assume that fake people are dramatic, flattering, charming, obviously trying too hard. Sometimes the tandapos true, but the more dangerous version of inauthenticity is subtle. It does nandapos announce itself. It simply adjusts, quietly and continuously, to whoever holds value in the room. And the unsettling part is that this adjustment is often not even a conscious choice. Itandapos, a strategy the mind adopts long before the person is aware they andapos, reusing one to understand why this happens. It helps to understand what psychologists call impression management, the ongoing, mostly automatic process by which people monitor how the andapos are being perceived and adjust their behavior to shape that perception favorably. This is nandapos, inherently sinister. Everyone does it to some degree. You speak differently to a grandparent than to a close friend. Tatandapos, not deception. Tatandapos, social calibration. And itandapos, a normal, healthy part of being a functioning social creature. The mechanism becomes a problem when calibration turns into a personandapos' primary operating mode, when nearly every interaction is filtered first through the question, and quote, what does this person expect from me? And what can I gain by giving it to them? End quote, rather than and quote, how do I actually feel? And what do I actually think? End quote. When that filter becomes the default, something interesting happens neurologically and behaviorally. The personandapos presentation becomes untethered from their internal state. They are no longer expressing anything. They are managing an output. This is cognitively expensive. Sustained impression management draws on the same mental resources used for self-control and complex reasoning, sometimes described as executive function. That resource is finite in any given stretch of time, which means a person running heavy impression management can maintain the performance under focused conditions, like a job interview or a first date. But the moment their attention is divided, tired, or unmonitored, the performance thins out. Speak. Speak. This is why inconsistency, not malice, is the real signature of inauthenticity. Fake is nandapos, a personality. Fake is a maintenance cost that eventually goes unpaid. There is a second layer to this mechanism worth naming: social comparison and status monitoring. Human beings are exceptionally sensitive to relative status. Who in a group holds influence, resources, or the ability to help or harm them. People who lead with performance rather than authenticity are often, consciously or not, running a constant status calculation. Is this person useful to me right now? Their warmth becomes a function of your perceived value rather than a fixed trait of their character. Watch what happens to that warmth when your perceived usefulness changes. When you endapos, you're no longer the one with the promotion to give, the introduction to make, the attention to offer. The mechanism reveals itself in the delta, in the difference between how someone treats you at your most useful and your least. History offers a strikingly consistent lesson here, and it comes from an unlikely place: succession crises. Across centuries and empires, one of the most reliable predictors of political betrayal was nandapos, ideology or personal grievance. It was proximity to a shift in power. Advisors, generals, and courtiers who had spent years performing loyalty to a ruler would, the moment that ruler Randapos's authority visibly weakened, realign with startling speed toward whoever looked likely to hold power next. Historians studying court politics have long noted this pattern. Loyalty that dissolves the instant it stops being profitable was never loyalty in the psychological sense. It was positioning, dressed in loyalty andapos, language. The same dynamic, at drastically smaller scale, plays out in modern organizations, and itandapos has been studied extensively in the psychology of leadership and organizational behavior. Researchers who study workplace dynamics have long distinguished between what ndapos, sometimes called anquat, impression management, upward anquat, and consistent behavior across hierarchy levels. Employees who are unusually deferential to superiors, while being dismissive or careless with those who hold less power, are exhibiting a pattern behavioral scientists associate with low integrity of character, regardless of how polished they appear to leadership. This asymmetry, kindness calibrated to power rather than principle, is one of the most consistently documented markers of manipulative or self-serving behavior in organizational psychology research. Therandapos as an economic concept that illuminates why this pattern is so hard to fake convincingly over time, and itandapos, called signaling. In economics, a signal is only meaningful if itandapos costly to produce, if producing it convincingly requires something a low-quality actor canandapos easily replicate. A performance of warmth that costs nothing to produce and nothing to sustain is a cheap signal, and cheap signals are, by definition, unreliable indicators of the underlying quality they claim to represent. Genuine character, by contrast, is expensive to fake precisely because it requires consistency across contexts where no one is grading the performance. That expense is exactly what makes it a reliable signal. This is why the question worth asking about anyone is nandapos anquat, how do they treat me when it matters sanquat, but anquat, how do they treat people when it does nandapos? Anquat. Consider a specific, ordinary situation. A team meeting where a colleague publicly agrees with every point a manager makes, nodding, affirming, occasionally adding an enthusiastic anquat, exactly anquat, and then, in a smaller side conversation later that same day, quietly criticizes those same ideas to a peer, framing them as flawed or poorly thought through. Neither version is necessarily a lie in the strict sense, but the gap between the two versions is the tell. A person operating from genuine conviction says roughly the same thing, whether the person in question is in the room or not. Speak. A person operating from impression management calibrates each version to its specific audience. Consider another, someone who is unfailingly attentive and complimentary to a person who can advance their career, and noticeably brisk, impatient, or dismissive with a support staff member, a junior employee, or a service worker who holds no leverage over them. This is one of the most quietly diagnostic moments available in ordinary life because it strips away the incentive to perform. There's nothing to gain from being kind to someone who can't help you, which means kindness offered there is close to uncontaminated by strategy, and its absence is equally uncontaminated by excuse. A third example, perhaps the most common, a friend who is deeply attentive and curious about your life during a conversation, asking thoughtful follow-up questions, and who then, within days, cannot recall basic details you shared. not because they're forgetful in general, but because the attentiveness was never really about you. It was a social technique, deployed convincingly in the moment, retained by no internal system because no internal system was actually engaged. Genuine curiosity leaves residue performed, curiosity evaporates the second the audience leaves the room. None of these examples require you to accuse anyone of anything. That's important. The purpose of noticing these patterns isn't to build a case against people. It's to calibrate your own trust more accurately. So you invest emotional energy where it's actually reciprocated rather than where it's just merely simulated. What connects all three examples is the same principle from section 2. Performance decays under low stakes, low visibility conditions because performance is expensive and character is not. The version of someone you see in a mirror they know is there tells you very little. The version you glimpse when they think the mirror is turned away tells you almost everything. This is where the picture starts to deepen because so far we've been describing what fake behavior looks like from the outside. What's more interesting and more useful is understanding why so many genuinely well-intentioned people misread this pattern for years, sometimes for a lifetime, without ever consciously registering what they were seeing. That misreading isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a specific, well-documented feature of how human perception handles inconsistency, and it's where we're headed next. Here is the idea that runs against most popular advice on this topic. Charisma is not evidence of authenticity. In fact, in many cases, the two move in opposite directions. The common assumption is that a warm, engaging, socially fluent person is more likely to be genuine because genuineness feels warm and warmth feels genuine. But social fluency and authenticity are separate skills entirely, developed through entirely different mechanisms, and a person can possess enormous amounts of one while possessing very little of the other. Highly skilled impression managers are, almost by definition, more socially fluent than average. They've had more practice reading rooms and adjusting to them because reading and adjusting is the entire operation. This means the most convincing performances of authenticity often come from people with the least of it. Not because deception requires more talent, but because performing sincerity convincingly is a skill like any other, and skills improve with repetition. Meanwhile, genuinely authentic people are sometimes socially rougher because they've spent less energy optimizing their presentation and more energy simply being consistent, which isn't always the same thing as being charming. This produces a genuinely uncomfortable but important recalibration. Warmth and charm should not be treated as evidence of trustworthiness at all. They should be treated as neutral, present in both trustworthy and untrustworthy people in roughly equal measure, while consistency across contexts should be weighted far more heavily than either. This isn't cynicism, it's simply recognizing that two different traits have been culturally collapsed into one, and separating them again is what allows accurate judgment. There's a related counterintuitive point worth sitting with. The people who are hardest to read are often not the most sophisticated manipulators. They're the most practiced ones. Sophistication implies conscious strategy, and conscious strategy has cognitive limits, as we discussed earlier. Practice, on the other hand, can become automatic, running below conscious awareness, indistinguishable even to the person doing it from genuine feeling. This is arguably more unsettling than deliberate manipulation because it means some people who behave inconsistently are not lying to you. They're lying to themselves first, and you're simply catching the residue. Underneath the desire to detect inauthenticity in others is usually a much older, more vulnerable feeling, the fear of having trusted the wrong person and not having known it in time. This fear is not irrational. Trust is one of the few resources that, once given, can be exploited retroactively. Every piece of information shared, every vulnerability disclosed, remains vulnerable even after the relationship ends. This is part of why betrayal, even minor betrayal, produces an emotional response disproportionate to the practical damage done. The mind isn't just processing the loss, it's processing the discovery that its own judgment failed somewhere and that failure feels like a threat to future safety, not just a past event. The Stoic philosophers offer a perspective worth considering here, not as an absolute rule, but as one useful frame among several. Epictetus drew a repeated distinction between what is within our control and what is not, and placed other people's character firmly outside that boundary. From this view, the goal is not to become someone who can never be deceived, which is not realistically achievable for any human being, but to become someone whose own integrity and judgment remain steady regardless of what others turn out to be. This reframes the entire emotional project. Instead of asking, "How do I make sure I'm never fooled again?" a more answerable question becomes, "How do I make sure my own behavior remains consistent and sound, independent of who turns out to be trustworthy?" There's an emotional trap worth naming directly: the temptation, after being deceived once, to treat inconsistency itself as proof of guilt everywhere it appears. This overcorrection feels protective but isn't accurate. People are inconsistent for many reasons that have nothing to do with deception, exhaustion, personal crisis, differing comfort levels in different environments, simple human variability. The skill being described in this video isn't suspicion, it's calibrated attention, noticing patterns without leaping to verdicts from a single data point, and holding conclusions loosely until enough evidence accumulates to justify them. There's also a quieter emotional dynamic worth acknowledging. Sometimes the discomfort we feel around a person isn't about detecting their inauthenticity at all. It's about the effort of maintaining our own performance around them. It's worth occasionally turning the lens inward and asking honestly whether the inconsistency we're noticing in someone else is a mirror of something we're doing too. Nobody is perfectly consistent all the time. The goal was never perfection. It was direction, moving toward more consistency, not achieving flawless consistency as some final state. The first and most useful strategy is what might be called cross-context observation. Rather than judging someone by any single interaction, deliberately observe them across at least two structurally different contexts: how they treat you compared to how they treat someone with no power over them, or how they behave under pressure compared to how they behave in comfort. Data point, however impressive or however troubling, tells you almost nothing about a pattern. Patterns require repetition across varied conditions, and the discipline here is resisting the urge to form a conclusion before enough varied data exists. The second strategy is tracking follow-through rather than promises. Promises are essentially free to make. They cost nothing at the moment of speaking and commit the speaker to nothing until a future point arrives. Follow-through is the only place where a promise endopos cost becomes real. This means the gap between what someone says they endopos I'll do and what they actually do, tracked over time and without excessive charity toward excuses, is one of the most statistically reliable predictors available to an ordinary observer, requiring no special psychological training to use. The third is a reasoning framework rather than a checklist. When you notice something that feels slightly off about a person, resist the instinct to immediately explain it away, and resist the opposite instinct to immediately condemn it. Instead, hold it as an open data point and ask what additional information would confirm or disconfirm it. This sounds almost clinical, and it is somewhat deliberately so. Emotional reasoning tends to either dismiss red flags too generously because we want to like people, or amplify them too aggressively because fear moves faster than analysis. A slower, evidence-gathering posture protects against both failure modes. The fourth strategy, and perhaps the most personally demanding, is applying every one of these standards to yourself first. Ask honestly whether your own warmth changes based on someone andopos' usefulness to you. Ask whether your private conversations about people would embarrass you if the person being discussed could hear them. This is nandopos about guilt. Itandopos is about recognizing that the capacity to read others accurately is inseparable from the honesty with which you andopos were willing to examine your own behavior, because a person who has never examined their own inconsistency tends to be the worst judge of everyone else andopos. What all four strategies share is patience. None of them offer instant verdicts, and datandapos intentional. The people most skilled at appearing trustworthy quickly are often the ones wandapos have learned that quick trust is easiest to exploit. Real judgment, the kind that actually protects you, is built slowly, which brings us to how a single shift in perspective can change not just what you notice, but how you relate to power, leadership, and negotiation. Altogether, consider negotiation, a field where reading authenticity accurately is nandapos, just a social nicety, itandapos, the entire game. Skilled negotiators are trained to distinguish between a counterpartandapos, stated position, and their underlying interest because the two are frequently different, and confusing them leads to worse outcomes for everyone involved. A person might say their position is anquat, I need this deadline moved, anquat, while their underlying interest is something closer to anquat, I need to look competent to my own leadership. End quote. The stated position is often a performance shaped by what the person believes will be persuasive. The underlying interest is closer to the truth of what they actually need. This distinction offers a powerful reframe for reading people generally, not just in formal negotiation. Instead of asking anquat, is this person being honest? Anquat, which produces a binary and often unanswerable question. Ask anquat, what does this person and dapos as behavior suggest about what they actually need or fear right now? End quote. This shift moves you from judge to analyst. Speak. A judge is looking for a verdict, trustworthy or not. An analyst is looking for a pattern. And patterns, unlike verdicts, can be revised as new information arrives without requiring you to have been wrong before. Leadership offers a parallel lesson. Effective leaders, across countless organizational studies and case histories, are consistently described not as the most charismatic figures in the room, but as the most predictable ones. People whose reactions to bad news, mistakes, and conflict remain steady rather than swinging based on mood or audience. Predictability, counterintuitively, is one of the most trust-generating qualities a person can have, precisely because it removes the guesswork that erodes psychological safety on a team. Teams donandapos need leaders who are always warm. They need leaders who are the same on a bad day as they are in front of their own boss. This reframing changes how you experience the discomfort of dealing with someone inconsistent. Instead of feeling destabilized by the question, anquat, can I trust them, end quote, which keeps you emotionally dependent on an answer you may never fully get, you shift to the more empowering question, anquat, what does their inconsistency tell me about how to structure my dealings with them? End quote. Perhaps that means keeping agreements in writing. Perhaps it means limiting what you disclose until a longer track record exists. The shift from moral verdict to strategic adjustment is itself the perspective change and itandapos available to you regardless of whether the other person ever becomes more consistent. Small, repeated choices about consistency compound in ways that are easy to underestimate in any single moment, but unmistakable over years. A person who allows themselves one small inconsistency, one flattering exaggeration, one unkind comment to someone beneath them in a hierarchy, one private contradiction of a public stance, rarely stops there, not because they andapos are uniquely dishonest, but because each instance lowers the psychological cost of the next one. Behavioral scientists studying habit formation have long observed that the difficulty of a first deviation from a standard is always higher than the difficulty of the second, because the first deviation requires overcoming an intact self-image, while the second only requires maintaining an image that tendapos has already been revised downward. The same compounding works in the opposite direction, and this is the more hopeful half of the pattern. A person who insists on consistency in small, unglamorous moments, being equally respectful to someone who can andapos advance their interests as to someone who can, following through on minor commitments no one would notice if broken, is building something with genuine long-term value, a reputation that requires no active management, because itandapos simply an accurate reflection of established behavior. This is in a very real sense an economic asset. Reputation of that kind reduces the effort required to be trusted in every future interaction, which compounds into opportunities, relationships, and outcomes that never explicitly acknowledge where they came from. Therandopos is a longer historical echo worth noting here. Across very different eras and institutions, the leaders and figures who maintained influence over long stretches of time were, disproportionately, not the most dazzling in a single moment, but the ones whose behavior across decades held up to scrutiny, the ones about whom, years later, colleagues and rivals alike would say some version of "Anquat," whatever else was true of them, they were the same person in private as they were in public. And quote, that specific kind of reputation is exceedingly rare precisely because it can be manufactured quickly. It can only be accumulated, one unglamorous, unwitnessed choice at a time. This is the deeper reason the pattern we and Dapo's been tracing throughout this video matters beyond the ability to spot untrustworthy people. Speak. Watching for consistency in others is only half the value. The other half is that the same discipline, turned inward, becomes the mechanism by which your own character compounds into something reliable, something that eventually other people will learn to read the same way you've been learning to read them. Everything in this video points back to a single quiet distinction, the difference between behavior that requires an audience and behavior that doesn't. Fake people are not identifiable by a look in their eye or a slip of the tongue. They're identifiable by the gap between the version of themselves they perform when it counts and the version that exists when they believe nothing is being counted at all. Genuine people close that gap, not perfectly, not always, but as a direction they keep returning to. What makes this understanding valuable isn't that it turns you into someone who can never be deceived. No framework offers that, and any framework that claims to is selling something. What it offers instead is patience, the willingness to watch across contexts, weigh follow-through over promises, and hold your conclusions loosely enough to be revised, while holding your own standards firmly enough to be worth having. The people who read others most accurately over a lifetime are rarely the most suspicious people in the room. They're the most attentive ones, and attention, unlike suspicion, doesn't cost you your capacity for trust. So the next time someone's warmth toward you seems to shift with your usefulness, or someone's private words don't match their public ones, remember that you're not just witnessing a flaw in their character, you're witnessing the exact mechanism this video has spent its length explaining. Performance straining under a condition it was never built to survive, nobody watching and nothing to gain.